Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and this topic that I found to be very particularly interesting. And for those of you that have watched enough of my videos, you know that a lot of the times on my channel that I like to review videos by that of the LDBC or that of new media. And just to talk about boxing purposes, especially, but really sports purposes, but especially the sport of boxing. A lot of sports, when it comes down to it, you know, it can really be debated with that of logic and objectivity because there are statistics, there are accomplishments, there is the resume, there's championships, there's MVPs, there's all-star appearances or Pro Bowls, whatever you kind of want to go over, Grand Slams, whatever accomplishments or whatever you basically want to go over. Well, in the boxing world, it can be a little bit more subjective because resumes can be a little bit more subjective depending on the person. And even though there is accomplishments, not every four-weight or three-weight division champion is built the same, and it's just very different. So that's why a lot of people, they may have very different pound for pound lists. You might have certain people that right now they may have Terrence Bud Crawford as the number one pound for pound fighter. Other lists might have Canelo Alvarez. Other lists might have Naoya Inoue. Other lists might have Usyk or Tyson Fury. You never know really what you're going to see. Some may even have Devin Haney or Beef. You never know what's going to happen. But the thing is overall about boxing as well, probably out of any sport that I've ever seen. Really, this pretty much goes for all combat sports, including that of the UFC. Racial pride is a very big part of it. And I don't think that anyone overall is basically innocent of it, or at least when you talk about the main demographics. And that's why I say that you have to be very careful, especially when you get into that of sports and boxing, especially that you don't get into that pro-racial element or that pro-racial pride at least too hard, because at the end of the day, it will ruin your logic and objectivity. And, just to talk about the LDBC and new media, I think that what they started out as was a group of people that wanted to cover black American fighters in a very positive light, because I think that in their view that a lot of black American fighters were the victim of double standards or kind of harsh judgment or harsh criticism that wasn't really deserved, even if it seemed like they were doing the right things in boxing, like facing great competition, putting on great performances, putting on great technical performances, yada 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 yada. And I can't necessarily disagree with them. When you talk about a lot of elite black fighters of the past, by that of the other demographics, you certainly can argue that they've been cheered against and that, they've been torn down. Floyd Mayweather, of course, a great example. Many people, even though with his resume and his great accomplishments, many people will try to detract from him and say that he's a runner and that he was a complete cherry picker. And I don't completely, agree with those statements. I think that Floyd Mayweather Jr. was an all-time great boxer, at least if you know what you're watching, in my view. However, that being said, the LDBC and new media, they're basically those type of fans that try to pick down or tear down Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Bernard Hopkins and Terrence Bud Crawford and all the elite black fighters. Basically, what the LDBC and new media is, they're basically those type of racist and pro-racial fans just turned inside out. They just go against that of the grain against other demographic of fighters. So basically, they want to protect the image of some of their favorite black American fighters or favorite black fighters so badly that at the end of the day, they also will basically do whatever they can to uplift their favorite fighters, including tearing down that of other fighters, especially that are not black American fighters. This includes that of Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, Vasily Lomachenko, Canelo Alvarez, Naoya Inoue. And don't get me wrong, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single criticism that they might state is necessarily incorrect in my view, or maybe that there's not a little bit of truth to it, but they oftentimes go way, way, way too far. And a lot of the same double standards and a lot of the same hypocrisy that they oftentimes complain about, they are even more overall guilty of it than that of quote unquote old media or ESPN or that of Ring Magazine. But anyways, in this video, we're going to review a video by that of Boxing Ego, Mr. Teofimo Lopez, who is within my top 10 pound for pound list right now. I think that I had him at number 9, right above Shakur Stevenson, just because, Shakur, he's an undefeated fighter and a legitimate three-weight division champion. But one thing I'll give Teofimo Lopez is this. He has something that I don't think any other fighter in the world has right now, and that's he defeated 2 fighters that when he defeated them, they were looked at as pretty much undisputedly as being on the top 10 pound for pound list for everybody, or at least pretty damn close to it. Lomachenko was looked at as the number 1 pound for pound fighter when he defeated him. And of course, Josh Taylor, he was looked at as a top 10 pound for pound fighter, or at the very least, top 12 pound-for-pound fighter when he defeated him and pretty much dominated him in the second half of that fight. So Teofimo Lopez right now would be one of my top pound-for-pound boxers. But of course, Teofimo Lopez did kind of suffer a stumbling block a couple of years ago when he lost to that of George Kambosos, and George Kambosos beat him, I believe, by that a split decision. And, certain people would claim robbery, certain people would say that, they would make excuses, including Teofimo Lopez himself. But at the end of the day, George Kambosos, in my view, did deserve to get that win. I thought that he clearly countered Teofimo Lopez's counterattacks very well. In my personal view, do I think that Teofimo Lopez probably had some mental issues going on, and, especially with his wife and his baby mama drama? Do I think that he took George Kambosos all that seriously? No, probably not, but at the end of the day, that's Teofimo Lopez's fault. And he had to kind of get back on the old hype train, and he had to kind of go back to the drawing board and revive his career. And that really was his fault. But Teofimo Lopez, of course, he still has not quite gotten over that loss, and he is making excuses. But the also interesting thing about this video is that Boxing Ego, who loves to criticize certain fighters like Canelo or Lomachenko or someone else like that when they make excuses for putting on a bad performance or losing a fight, this is also the very same guy that puts up excuses for Deontay Wilder or that of Errol Spence Jr. Remember, Boxing Ego is the same guy right now that is stating that he believes Errol Spence Jr. when apparently he had a cataract problem in that of the Terrence Bud Crawford fight, and that's why he performed so badly. But apparently with Teofimo Lopez, let's see if he gives him the same amount of leeway. Let's see if he gives him the same amount of trust. Let's see if he puts up the same standards. Let's see what happens.
We unpack. I'm someone that I went through some real hard times when I faced George Kambosos. I was actually dying in that fight. 3 doctors that have PhDs in New York said that they can't.
I think that you were somewhat dying, Teofimo Lopez, but I don't think that you were dying in the physical manner that you're alleging. I think that you were dying mentally, and I think that you were wore down. And I think overall that you were pretty much very mentally wore down. I think that you were very exhausted, and I think that more than likely you were very depressed. Kind of like very similar to that of Jamal Charlo and Jamel Charlo right now, who apparently, from what I'm hearing, at least with Jamal Charlo, they're both having a lot of problems with both of their wives. And, this happens with a lot of athletes to where that divorce happens, and it seems like that woman takes a lot of energy from that man, and it takes a very, very long time for them to kind of recover their stamina or for them to recover their energy. Now, from what I hear, maybe Teofimo and his wife are doing good. I don't know, but at the end of the day, sometimes that really does affect boxers very bad mentally. And I think that, to be honest with you, that probably was the main problem.
I believe I'm still alive, just with the conditions that I had going into that fight, fighting 12.
And you see Boxing Ego smiling there, basically alleging that Teofimo Lopez is making excuses. Once again, isn't it very interesting that Teofimo Lopez makes an excuse? And I also agree that it is not a valid excuse. I agree that it's ridiculous to allege that you apparently had a bubble or something up with your lungs and all sorts of stuff, but yet you were cleared in a professional fight. But also keep those same standards for Deontay Wilder. Also keep those same standards for that of Errol Spence Jr.
But how were you passed for that fight? How were you passed to fight then? With medicals?
Yeah, see, I can't get myself more caught up than I already am in with these commissions and everybody. That's all I can say.
Oh.
Yeah, bullshit, Teofimo. And I like Teofimo, as a fighter. He's a great boxer. But at the end of the day, you're full of shit, Teofimo. You lost. It is what it is. And he can accept that, he cannot accept that, but, gladly for him, he certainly has revived his career into a better light.
That's all I can say, and it's a freedom of speech. So for everybody, George Washington said it himself, freedom of speech.
Right, but it's a freedom of speech. Basically, what is Teofimo trying to state here? Whenever someone says something stupid like that, or, I always get like some of these fans, whenever I claim that a fighter, in my view, that they're not fighting the best of competition. I always get this from the Gervonta Tank Davis fans. They bring up almost some of the same stupid bullshit that's almost very similar when I bring up that Gervonta is not fighting the greatest competition. And remember, these are the same fans, these are the same guys that criticize Canelo, even when he's fighting A-grade level fighters for allegedly fighting bums, or guys that have already lost or that are washed up, blah, blah, blah. But then when you talk about Gervonta Tank Davis, then people say, why are you hating? Why are you pocket watching? He's in charge of his own career. Why don't you get in, in the classic, why don't you get in the boxing ring? You would only last 15 minutes, all this, 5 minutes, all sort of stupid shit, which has nothing to do with the conversation. We all know that you have freedom of speech, Teofimo Lopez, but what is Teofimo basically stating here? I have the freedom of speech and I'm allowed to say whatever bullshit that I want to. That's really what he's stating. And the reason why he's stating that is because he knows he's full of shit.
If the freedom of speech is taken away, then sheep are we led is what he says. It's like sheep being led to a slaughter. So that's why
right. But just like Deontay Wilder, when he tried to come up with these bullshit excuses about why he lost to Tyson Fury, people always do this when they try to make excuses. They always try to sound like Martin Luther King or some bullshit like this. They always try to sound like this profound figure, to where they were a victim of this huge injustice, or, they always try to be way deeper than what they actually are. At the end of the day, bro, it's not that deep. You probably had some mental issues going on, and on top of that, you probably thought that George Kambosos was going to be an opponent that you were going to knock out within 6 to 7 rounds. You thought wrong, and at the end of the day, you lost that fight. Doesn't mean overall that you did not become a better fighter because of it, or that you're not a great fighter. But at the end of the day, you lost that fight.
Dollar is still around. Until they let go of my freedom of speech, then there goes our dollar.
Hey, yo, what? Teofimo Lopez says he was dying, MDK, in the George Kambosos fight in a brand new interview. He says this was, I guess, examined, his case. They did a case study on Teofimo from the Kambosos fight, and three doctors with PhD.
Isn't it very interesting how they never have any proof of this situation? That it's always, by word of mouth or something like that. There's never actually a doctor that is stating it on the video or anything like that. It's always some bullshit like this. Just like when BOXINGEGO and, these idiots from the LDBC and new media, they tried to allege that Deontay Wilder had this dent in his head, all this other bullshit, but yet there were no x-rays that were ever shown. There was now no pictures that actually ever showed a dent in his skull. Yet they were trying to allege this. So once again, isn't that always very interesting? But keep in mind, BOXINGEGO and a lot of these other guys, they were perfectly fine with that excuse for Deontay Wilder.
These, I guess, confirmed that he was dying in the fight. Wow. I guess I gotta talk about it. What up, Fight World? It's your boy Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. Now, that was a brand new interview ahead of his upcoming fight with Jermaine Ortiz. I believe the date is February 8th. Top Rank, ESPN. Good fight. I got some other content about that fight. If you're interested, you should be interested because I think it's a good fight. The two fought each other.
It's a very interesting fight. Jermaine Ortiz, of course, ended up losing to Vasily Lomachenko, who, of course, Ego would tell you got robbed against Lomachenko. It wasn't a robbery. Jermaine Ortiz ended up losing that fight probably about 7 rounds to 5. But he gave it a very competitive go. And Jermaine Ortiz is a very talented boxer, so I'll tell you what. In fact, he might actually be somewhat similar to that of George Kambosos, just a little bit more slick. So it's going to be a very interesting fight. A very interesting fight indeed. Jermaine Ortiz is not to be underestimated.
Amateurs. And
let me also state this. Because some people, they ask me on my pound for pound list, how could you have Teofimo Lopez over Gervonta Tank Davis? How could you possibly have that? Well, it's not really that hard to understand. Gervonta Tank Davis may be an undefeated fighter and debatably the most talented fighter around those weight divisions. But until I see him beat a potential top 10 pound for pound fighter, or hell, even a top 20 pound for pound fighter, he's not going to be over Teofimo Lopez or Shakur Stevenson on my pound for pound list. Because at the end of the day, you've only been a legitimate champion really within one weight class. Maybe he has the belt at 135 now because they gave it to him. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to see. But at the end of the day, or because he was in position to get that belt. I don't want to make it sound like he got it just because he didn't completely deserve it. But at the end of the day, he's really only a legitimate champion within that one weight division from what I know. Unless they gave him the belt at 135 already, the official one. And then on top of that, these fighters like Mario Barrios and Isaac Pitbull Cruz, like, I'm sorry, but none of these guys are legitimate A-grade fighters. Rolly Romero, none of these guys are legitimate A-grade fighters. None of them. I would say that Jermaine Ortiz, in my view, that he's probably above all those guys, besides maybe Mario Barrios. But I would say that Jermaine Ortiz, he's probably he's definitely more talented than that of Rolly Romero in Isaac Pitbull Cruz. No doubt about that. Mario Barrios might be along the same level. Either way, I'm not quite sure if I would say Jermaine Ortiz is an A-grade level fighter. If he is, maybe A minus, but I'm not quite sure if I'm going to put him on the A minus level. I would probably say B plus to B. But at the end of the day, Jermaine Ortiz, in my view, he would be a bigger threat, definitely, than what Isaac Pitbull Cruz or Rolly Romero ever would be.
2024 has been kind of dry. We've been on a drought in terms of actual fights happening. So I'm glad to see. I'm looking forward to that fight. That might be the fight that I'm most looking forward to.
It's a new year. I don't know. I don't know. Why people expected these humongous fights to happen in January. I mean, to be fair, we've already kind of gotten some decent fights. John Ryder versus Jaime Munguia. We got Arthur Beterbiev versus Callum Smith. Those are not super bad matchups. So far, I actually don't think that it's been a very bad year.
Made a video about Jaime Munguia and things like that, but I wasn't really stoked about that fight. I knew the outcome. But this is kind of a pick'em fight, a 60-40 type of fight. Some would even say 50-50 with Teofimo and Jermaine Ortiz. So make sure y'all check that out. But
you'll notice that a lot of these channels say that I'm not super stoked on that fight between that of Jaime Munguia and John Ryder. The reason why that is because they know that Canelo Alvarez very well might fight Jaime Munguia next. Now, if that was Demetrius Bubo Andrade versus John Ryder, then they would have been more stoked on that fight because they have a little bit of stock within that of Demetrius Andrade. They have no stock within that of Jaime Munguia. The only way that they would have stock within Jaime Munguia is if he fights Andrade or Charlo or a black fighter that they need to push next.
Teofimo, he's back at it again. He did an interview with the Best Women's Boxing Show. Shout out to them. And he said that he was dying in the fight. Now, some of you guys who follow my channel, this shouldn't be new that Teofimo is saying this because, as you know, Teofimo suffered his lone loss to George Kambosos, and it was on DAZN, actually. It's hard to even go into because this is why subscribing to the channel does you a favor. I put out the content.
Yes, if you like to listen to bullshit. Anyway, and don't get me wrong, in my view, actually, Ego does not have the worst channel out there. I think that at times he brings up some very good points. But it's clear that the double standards and hypocrisy from him, it's no better overall than that of many of these pro-racial or racist fans. It just is what it is. That's why these guys, they always love to complain about double standards and all sort of shit. All they are is just fans. What fans love to do is that they love to complain about these double standards, because they're trying to protect their favorite athletes or the people that they view to be gods or the guys that they're completely obsessed with. And then they'll turn it around against other guys because they're trying to protect the legacy of their favorites. So Boxing Ego is not really an objective and logical analyzer, as well as none of the LDBC or new media channels. All they are is fans.
There's only so much I can recap, so you really got to be able to keep up. And the best way to keep up is to hit the subscribe button. So at the end of the day, when I publish these videos, you'll be able to see them and know what's going on in the world of boxing. So I'll give you guys the cliff notes, if you will. Teofimo Lopez, he started beefing with Top Rank, and he was saying he's going against Todd DeBuff, all this kind of drama. At the time, Triller was trying to make a mark in the sport of boxing, trying to make a play in boxing. They won the purse bid for Teofimo Lopez versus George Kambosos. They had the number one winning bid. Number two was DAZN, and Teo's own promoter was number three. So Top Rank put out the lowest bid in the top three. They were outbid basically by two other companies that didn't manage Teofimo or George Kambosos at the time. So with that winning bid, Triller had the rights to stage and pay the fighters, but also stage the fight. And they defaulted. Long story short, month after month, people kept waiting and waiting for this fight. They were saying they were going to fight in Miami, Florida, I think it was. And Floyd Mayweather announced he was fighting Logan Paul in Florida. So that kind of killed Teofimo's fight. And they rescheduled the fight and said, nah, we're not doing it. I think it was because of Floyd Mayweather, Logan Paul pay-per-view basically in the same region. So Floyd Mayweather moved him off the date. Teo said he had the Rona, and he said he was in Italy, but then he had the Rona all kinds of stuff. But in my opinion, I think they moved off that date because they knew it wouldn't be smart for a Kambosos Teofimo fight to go against Floyd. Money Mayweather, easy work. I ain't got to worry about it. Right? It just didn't make sense. Hard work, dedication. Make sure you subscribe. So they moved off the date, and then in the end, Triller didn't even do the fight. They defaulted. The fight went to DAZN. Teofimo Lopez ended up fighting George Kambosos, and he ended up fighting him on DAZN. And that's his sole loss, as I mentioned earlier in this video. He lost to George Kambosos. He came out like a wild man, like a man.
He did lose in my view. But what's also very interesting is that Boxing Ego, what you'll notice is that with his favorite black American fighters especially, whenever it comes to their alleged losses that a lot of people believe they probably should have lost, even the ones that in my view, you know, there's sometimes where people will say that something is a robbery and you can watch the fight and clearly tell that it's not a robbery. But, you know, Ego is one of those guys that whenever it comes to the fighters that he tries to tear down, it's always a robbery or that fighter got screwed, like Jermaine Ortiz got screwed against Lomachenko, or Danny Jacobs got screwed against Gennady Golovkin, you know, or, you know, some of these other things like Alexander Usyk, where he should have been knocked out against Danny Dubois. But then Wilder gets a robbery draw over that of Tyson Fury, and that really was a robbery when it came down to it, if you know what you're watching. And, you know, apparently he has no problem with that decision. Jamel Charlo gets a terrible, or at least, you know, a not very good decision, you know, split draw, you know, with that of Brian Castano in the first fight, you know, and apparently, you know, it's a deserved draw when it comes down to it. You know, it's just very interesting, depending on the fighter, what's a robbery and what isn't.
Yeah, man, just, you know, swinging for the fences, which is not even really his style. T.O.'s more of a boxer, puncher. He has some swag in there, some skill.
I would love to see a fight between that of Teofimo Lopez and Devin Haney. And whoever were to win that fight, in my view, you could very easily push them to the top 5 pound for pound. In my view, in order to be the top 5 pound for pound, you have to be making a whole lot of moves. And if Devin Haney and Teofimo Lopez, if they're able to win that fight, they could easily be top 5 pound for pound. It's just very difficult for me to really rearrange my top 5 pound for pound, because those are the fighters that have the best resumes, and on top of that, the best skill sets and the best amount of dominance when it comes down to it, and the best amount of accomplishments. When you're talking about my top 5 pound for pound, you're talking about Crawford, you're talking about Inoue, Usyk, Tyson Fury, and Canelo Alvarez. You know, and it's just very hard for me to rearrange that top 5 pound for pound list, because those guys have defeated some top 10 pound for pound fighters. But especially if Teofimo Lopez was able to win the fight against Devin Haney, that would mean that he has defeated his third top 10 pound for pound fighter. And I would have no choice but to put him probably over someone within my top 5, or at the very least put him at number 6. And Devin Haney, even though I don't think he's ever defeated a legitimate top 10 pound for pound fighter, at least when they probably would have been ranked in the top 10 pound for pound, one could certainly also argue that that easily is going to put him within the top 5 as well. So that would be a great fight. I would love to see that fight.
But maybe the delay, the whole trash talk at the...
And I'm not quite sure who would win that fight either. You know, because Devin Haney, he kind of has a very defensive style where he likes to fight on the back foot. And I think that more than likely he would have the reach, definitely have the reach advantage and the speed advantage. But Teofimo Lopez, he definitely would have the power. And I think overall that he probably is the better counterpuncher out of that of Devin Haney. However, that would be a very interesting fight, because if Teofimo Lopez were going to win that fight, he'd have to try to really cut off the ring, be very defensively responsible against that of Devin Haney. And he have to really up his counterpunching ability, or at least overall really up his offense and the ante in that fight. He would have to make sure to make Devin Haney uncomfortable the whole entire time. And he can't just do it the way he did against Josh Taylor and Vasily Lomachenko. He has to be first against that of Devin Haney, and he has to really up the ante, go to the body very early on, and overall pressure him and really make him submit in that fight. And Teofimo, I'm just not quite sure if he's that type of boxer. He's more of a guy to where he's a little bit more of a reactionary guy, you know, who reacts to a lot of counters. And he's a great counter shot guy, you know, and he can be first, just like he was against Vasily Lomachenko. But he's going to have to be first a lot more often and much more defensively responsible against that of Devin Haney than what he probably ever has been. Can he do that? I'm not quite so sure.
Press conference with Kambosos, he was saying a lot of stuff at the time, saying he's going to be a $20 million fighter in no time. So I don't know. I don't know what it was, but there was a lot of pressure on Teofimo at that given time. And that was arguably his worst performance. It's the only performance where the judges had him losing. So with that being said, Kambosos won fair and square and Teofimo is now left picking up the pieces and trying to explain why he lost on that fateful night. So what did Top Rank and Teofimo's side conjure up? They conjured up this whole storyline that
Right, but basically what you're saying is that he conjured it up as if he's lying, and I agree with you. I think that he is lying. But how come Errol Spence Jr. and Deontay Wilder did not conjure up this bullshit? How come it's only Teofimo Lopez or Vasily Lomachenko or Canelo Alvarez that are conjuring up storylines? It's never his fighters or his fighters overall, or let's be real, his favorite black American fighters, because that's what the LDBC and the media is, a pro-black cult when it comes down to it. How come those guys are never conjuring up narratives?
his esophagus was gonna blow up or something, and he had all these medical emergencies, and as a result, that's why he lost the Kambosos fight. Listen, man, I'm not listening to that, because here's
Really, why not? Has Teofimo Lopez ever lied in the past, Mr. Boxing Ego? Has he ever proven to lie in the past about things? That's the same thing that you said about Errol Spence Jr. So if we're going to believe, or I should say you're going to believe, Errol Spence Jr.'s excuses of why he lost so badly to that at Crawford, why should we not possibly take the time overall to do that against that of Teofimo Lopez? Now, some people overall may say, well, that's not completely fair, Mr. Boxing Realist, because at the end of the day, Errol Spence Jr. has had cataract surgery in the past, and on top of that, he has had car accidents, and that's fair enough. I understand that. But at the end of the day, they give you very deep inspections before heading into the fight. And what Boxing Ego is trying to make us believe, or what he's saying that, Errol Spence, what might be true about Errol Spence is that I'm supposed to believe that he had this major inspection and that his eyes were more than likely cleared, or a doctor let him fight possibly with a cataract injury, in which that's Errol Spence's problem anyway. But what you're telling me is that his eye was so compromised to the point to where it was a little bit blurry, or to the point overall to where he couldn't see a jab coming, and he decided in the biggest fight of his career to go ahead and fight Terrence Bud Crawford. I'm sorry, but no.
the thing. And stay tuned to the end of the video, because I got a surprise that many people do not know about. And I definitely will reveal that in this particular video. So make sure you stay tuned to the very end of this video. What is happening in modern boxing? We are entering an era where there's zero accountability. Fighters announcing fights on social media, on X, Twitter, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitch, anywhere but where it actually matters, and having the fight signed on the dotted line and ready to go. You're seeing an emergence.
Well, to be quite honest with you, and I don't completely disagree with Boxing Ego and perhaps social media and the fact that boxers are a little bit more in charge of what they can do, and the fact that there's more belts and other stuff like that, you might be able to debate that, there's no accountability from that of some of the boxers. Maybe this era is, more lacking accountability. But to be quite honest with you, with elite level athletes, the lack of accountability, especially from a lot of elite level athletes, it's pretty much always been present. I mean, I'm not saying that, accountability is not something that you should not have. But with elite level athletes, for them to believe that they're the greatest of their era or the best in the world, they basically have to tell themselves certain excuses, even just to look at themselves in the mirror and think that they're not a complete failure, just to stop them from killing themselves or just to sleep at night. When it comes down to looking themselves in the mirror the next morning. We've seen many athletes do this. Guillermo Rigondeaux, Vasily Lomachenko, Manny Pacquiao, Deontay Wilder. But, not even a part of this era, when it comes down to it. George Foreman made excuses when he ended up losing to Muhammad Ali. When it came down to Marvin Hagler, kind of made, an excuse of him getting quote-unquote robbed against Sugar Ray Leonard, even though many people would believe it. I never did. I always thought Sugar Ray won that fight, but it is what it is. But many people have been making excuses for many, many years. People have always made excuses as to why they ended up losing a fight. Mike Tyson, and a certain amount of other boxers. So to be honest with you, this has always kind of been a pattern with elite level athletes anyway. But I think that especially with the media and certain sports media, because they coddle certain athletes, and on top of that, when it comes down to it, maybe more padded records, and the use of social media a little bit as well, you can maybe argue overall that this is an era to where athletes are a little bit more coddled, or to where there's less accountability. Certainly throughout, a certain amount of sports, just like LeBron James, he has no accountability whatsoever. But that's because the media completely coddles him. I've always said this: the main three athletes throughout my era growing up that never had to take any accountability for losing or, performing a bad act was LeBron James, Aaron Rodgers, and Serena Williams. Those guys are basically treated like God when it came down to it. They can never do any wrong within that of the media. When Serena Williams had that tantrum all the way back, I believe, in the 2018 U.S. Open against Naomi Osaka, they said, it's because overall they were rooting against her when it came down to that. The line judge was racist and all this other bullshit, even though she was receiving coaching when it came down to, which is, somewhat not allowed. Some line judges call it, some line judges don't call it, or some give a penalty, some don't give a penalty. But that was known as a very strict judge, I believe. I believe his name was Mora or whatever his name is. I would have to look at it. But anyway, when it comes down to it, I agree that this generation is lacking a little bit more accountability. There's also a certain amount of fans and boxing fans that are also to thank for that. And that also is partially helped with that of BOXINGEGO and the LDBC and new media. Because they also have no sense of accountability and they love to make excuses with their favorite fighters. And you have a lot of these losers that instead of, pretty much just fessing up and saying that they're athletes or, they're gods in their view, that they're not as good as what they viewed them as, when it comes down to it. But the reason why that is, the reason why you won't have people say that I was wrong and that this person just had more faults or, they were not as good as what I once thought they were is because they're obsessed with these people. And when you're obsessed with someone, you treat them basically like a god when it comes down to with someone that can do no wrong. You're completely obsessed with that person, and that's not a good thing to do. And if you're a major fan of somebody or a fan of someone in general, then you're not an objective or logical commentator. You can't be. Because your main mission is always going to be to make that person look the best as possible, even if you have to tear other people down. And that's why I say the LDBC and new media, they're not trustworthy. They're not any more trustworthy than any other possible racist or pro-racial fan. Not only because of the pro-racial narrative, but because they're mega fanboys. You can't trust someone who's a fan.
Of stuff like that. There go Tio from the Kambosos fight. So you're seeing an emergence of this type of behavior, this, as I call it, no accountability behavior. And it's getting ridiculous in the sport of boxing. Fighters thinking they're going to make the fight and their team is not trying to make the fight, but then they announce the fight. We've seen this with Ryan Garcia. He's, just public negotiations. Ryan saying and Devin Haney saying they're fighting each other or at least negotiating. Doing all of it in public, and that's not the way to go. It's not the way to get the fans involved. There's no reason for the fans to be involved.
I agree. A lot of the times when it comes to negotiations or public negotiations about, I'll do this or, I'll do that, I'll bet my purse. All that is really usually a bunch of wolf tickets or all that is really just for show. A lot of that is really just, to try and impress the fans and keep them subsided for the fight not possibly happening. Or maybe a little bit of hype for the fight, but a lot of the times that shit is very fake, and it isn't really gonna, what gets the fight done, and those fighters know that, so that's why whenever that happens, and you have these channels like Dante's Boxing Nation, like, we have to give a lot of credit for Gervonta Tank Davis calling out that of Josh Taylor. It's like, yeah, I'll believe it when I see the contract signed. Or when I see the fight date set up. It's like, these fighters, whenever they talk all that shit on social media, this is wolf tickets.
And it's not a way to get the business handled, right? But what is also happening, and I've been in boxing for many, many moons now, what is also happening, and you're also starting to see, is the lack of accountability for fighters when they lose. When the fighter...
I agree, but which fighter specifically, Mr. Boxing Ego? Name some. And not just Vasily Lomachenko, not just Teofimo Lopez, not just some of those other fighters, or Manny Pacquiao, Deontay Wilder, Errol Spence Jr. as well. I would somewhat agree, but to be honest with you, it just might seem overall like the lack of accountability is more this era because social media spreads rampantly, and there's more networks now than there ever has been before. So at the end of the day, we just might receive more news. But to be honest with you, I was born in 1998, so I can't tell you. I can't tell you how many excuses were made back in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. But what I do know is that excuses have always been used by sports teams and athletes pretty much ever since the beginning of competition.
And most fighters undoubtedly lose. Statistically, it's very hard to fight the best and remain undefeated. Now, if you fight scrubs and your record is patterned, then yeah, maybe with a padded record, you remain undefeated. But what I'm seeing is an emerging pattern when these fighters lose. They have a million different excuses.
Isn't that very interesting how these LDBC and new media channels, they talk about Gilberto Soto Ramirez and Jaime Munguia and said that they had padded records, and that's why I can't put them high within the rankings. And let me tell you what, I don't completely disagree with that. Both Gilberto Soto Ramirez and Jaime Munguia, they do have completely padded records. You're not going to find a lot of champions or a lot of elite fighters on their resume. So all that 40-something bullshit, when it comes down to it, it really doesn't have much substance because they haven't really fought anybody, when it comes down to it. But at the end of the day, then when it came to Deontay Wilder, 40-something he's one of the greatest heavyweight champions of all time. He's a top 10 and top 5 pound per pound fighter. I remember when Deontay Wilder was an undefeated fighter. And I used to have people in my comment section stating that, oh, no, you're wrong. Deontay is definitely a top 10 pound per pound boxer. How is he a top 10 pound per pound boxer when he's never fought and beaten an official top 10 pound per pound fighter? And Deontay Wilder has only ever fought 3 champions within his career, when it comes down to it. And I think that's former and overall current when he fought them. He fought Bermain Stavern, he fought that of Joseph Parker, and he fought that of Tyson Fury. He lost 2 out of 3 of those fights, or 2 out of 3 of those opponents. So at the end of the day, no, Wilder never was a top 10 pound per pound fighter. In my view, he would have been top 20. But no, he wasn't top 10.
Like nonstop.
And once again, these are the same channels that love to bitch, moan, and complain about the double standards and the racism when someone like Lomachenko, overall, and, someone like Canelo or Inoue is placed on a pound per pound list. Or especially certain people like Inoue, or Lomachenko, they're put on a pound per pound list and they don't have that many fights, on their record. That was the excuse of Lomachenko, right? But he was fighting repeated A-grade champion after repeated A-grade champion. Or at least a lot of champions that a lot of people knew of. And he was dominating them, at least at the time. And not just people like Anthony Crowell or, certain people like, what the hell is his name? Like Rocky Martinez. Like he was beating the shit out of, Nicholas Walters, Guillermo Rigondeaux, Gary Russell Jr., Jorge Linares. Like Vasily Lomachenko was going to work. And then of course Naoya Inoue, he doesn't have, in my view, the greatest of resumes, but he at least probably has a couple of A-grade level fighters. And in that matchup that everyone was asking for against Stevan Coolboy Fulton, he dominated him. So at the end of the day, once again, we have to give credit. But those are the same guys, these are the same channels that love to bitch, moan, and complain about how it's disrespectful to put Inoue as the number 1 pound per pound fighter. Yet you'll find these channels like Champside, they'll put Jaron Boots Ennis as a top 10 pound per pound fighter when he's never won a belt in his life, last year when it came down to it, or at least did not when he put him on the top 10 pound per pound list. Or they'll claim that Terrence Crawford is the clear number 1 pound per pound fighter and that he's getting disrespected even though he had never fought a top 10 pound per pound fighter before and did not have the most extensive of resumes. It just is what it is. And then they put Deontay Wilder in the top 5 or top 10 when he had never beaten a clear A-grade level fighter other than Luis Ortiz. But, it is what it is.
And it's getting to the point, it's almost like, at this point, it's almost like PED test fails. There are and I do mean very few people who fail a PED test for X, Y, and Z, and they tested positive for a banned substance, and they just come out and say, hey, it was me, guys. I was on nandrolone. I was on this metastosterone and all these other random drug names. It is very, very rare. What does...
Well, tell the time overall when someone's ever been caught on steroids, and they just usually flat out admitted it and said, yeah, I've been taking steroids basically for my whole entire career. Whoever usually has admitted that shit. I mean, don't get me wrong, I get it. Accountability would be great. But other than bodybuilders, it's like you're not overall going to get any accountability there. I mean, what fighters have ever really full on admitted that have been caught on steroids, that have ever just come out and fully stated, yeah, I was completely on steroids. Canelo didn't do it. I don't think Shane Mosley did it. Other fighters didn't do it. John Jones didn't do it. It's like, how many fighters that have been caught on steroids, how many of them really just came out and admitted it? I mean, TJ Dillashaw, after he got caught, I guess.
Happened is the fighter or fighters.
But TJ Dillashaw kind of had to take that approach because, Cody Garbrandt and that whole alpha male team, they were kind of after his ass. And don't get me wrong, I think that the rest of alpha male was on steroids too, including that idiot Neanderthal Cody Garbrandt. But when it comes down to it, he kind of had to take that approach because he knew the publicity that he was getting from that of the Ultimate Fighter. When Cody Garbrandt and the rest of alpha male, they were alleging that he was teaching them how to use EPO. So, TJ Dillashaw kind of had to take the humble approach there Otherwise, he was going to get chewed up even more. And his legacy still is not the same ever since he's been caught on steroids.
Drug test, and they say, oh, I don't know how that got in my system. Like Oscar Valdez with the phentermine. Oh, maybe it's some herbal tea I drank. Maybe that's it, right? So it's just a lack of accountability era. 2024, we as fans, we need to change that. We need to start questioning what's being said, the information that is being relayed to us, and Teofimo is no exception to that rule.
Right, but neither is Errol Spence Jr. or Deontay Wilder. And what you really need to do is that you need to keep the same standards for everybody. And the reason why it's also very easy for some of these fighters to make excuses is because they know they have this big cult of personality, you know, meaning that they have a cult-like fan base to where basically they'll defend them to the ends of the earth. That's why a lot of the times it's so easy for them to make excuses, especially, you know, from these LDBC new media channels, because they definitely have the back of those fighters, and I respect it to a degree. You know, the fact that you respect those fighters and the fact that you cover them in a better light and the fact that you give them interviews and put them, you know, of course, in a better light. That's great. All that is, you know, very great. That's a great positive that the LDBC and new media brings. But you also must keep the same standards and the same energy with everybody else. And the LDBC and new media has never been known to do that.
Tio can fight. You know, he showed that in many of his fights, like Lomachenko, and also his fight with, really his last fight with Josh Taylor. You know what I mean? But the accountability of like him losing to Kambosos, you lost. You ain't beat Lamont Peterson. You lost. Like, no matter what you say, you lost. And him continuing to double down and triple down on this whole storyline that doctors are telling him he's lucky to be alive and he was near death and dying in the ring and stuff, to me, it's just a bad look. Because
right, same thing for Errol Spence Jr. and Deontay Wilder when they were making those same bullshit excuses. But how come, you know, with you, Mr. Ego, you know, this objective and logical commentator, and you always give it to us real and all this other bullshit, how come Deontay Wilder and Errol Spence don't get the same criticism from you? I already know what the answer is. But, you know, at the end of the day, when it comes down, I just find it very interesting. And this is why I like to review these channels, because I get these guys on my comment section saying, oh, you're just mad because they're telling the truth. What the LDBC and new media is, they are the pro-black cult version of ESPN and old media. That's all they are. So, you know, these guys claim all this shit about we don't like old media because they have these double standards and they're disrespecting our fighters, blah, blah, blah. All the LDBC and new media are is what they call themselves. New media. They're the complete, you know, they're basically the competitor overall with that of old media. You know, they seem different in certain ways, but really a lot of their goals are the same. It's just projected towards somebody different.
First of all, I think the host, who I know, shout out to her, the host Cynthia, she did a great job with the follow-up question. If you listen,
I agree. That's a great question.
Again, she literally said,
and that's the same questions that 78 Sports TV and other fighters like that should have been doing when it came to Deontay Wilder and putting him on the spot. Like Deontay Wilder, if you truly believe that Tyson Fury put something in his gloves and did all this other shit, how come overall you're not suing Tyson Fury? How come that? You know, overall, if you believe that he did that in his gloves, why did you fire that in Mark Breland, who didn't watch Tyson Fury's hand wraps in his gloves? Why did you not fire JD's? But instead, there was no pressing him to the iron or putting his feet overall to the coals when it came down to it, or pressing his feet to the fire because they worship him like a god.
But how was this passed through the commission? Like, how did you... We're talking about in boxing, there are 3 commissions that are notorious for being the strictest. That's in no particular order: Nevada, California, and on the East Coast.
Right, so then here's the question. Why are you giving Errol Spence Jr. that much leeway when it comes to his alleged bullshit excuses for losing to Terrence Bud Crawford? But then when it comes to Teofimo Lopez, do you know how strict these guys are and all sort of stuff? So once again, there's a clear double standard going on here as well.
Got to choose a coast, I got to choose the East. I live out there, so don't go there, right? Like Biggie said, the East Coast, they got New York. These are the strictest commissions in boxing, right? And somehow, some way, this fight took place in Teofimo's second home or his backyard. They say he's from New York, whatever, right? And that was a great question from the host. how did this pass? How did you get cleared to fight if your esophagus exploded and you were near death? How come a ref didn't stop the fight in the middle of the fight? Your father's your trainer. How come he didn't stop the fight if he knew all this stuff? You entered the fight with the blown out esophagus or whatever you're trying to claim now, and that you keep saying, which is making your brand look bad.
I agree. And the same standard should be applied to that of Mr. Errol Spence Jr. and should have been applied to that of Deontay Wilder. Now, some people might ask me this question, which would be a fair question, and they say, well, Mr. Boxing Realist, Errol Spence Jr. has had cataract problems in the past, but isn't it much more believable to believe that Errol Spence might have had a slight problem with his eye, more than what Teofimo Lopez would have had a blown out esophagus? And certainly, yeah, no, probably. But at the end of the day, I'm just not buying this this excuse of why the reason why Errol Spence got beat up so badly is because he couldn't see the jabs coming because something was up with his eye. You telling me that your eye was that compromised and blurry to the point to where in the biggest fight of your life, and probably was going to be the biggest fight ever in your career, that you went ahead with that fight and you couldn't even see jabs coming your way right before that fight? I'm not believing it. I'm sorry.
Why wasn't the fight not, like, why did the fight even start? Let alone, why didn't someone finish it? Like, for example, Tio's own father, his flesh and blood, is your coach. Like, that's your trainer. So if you knew, let's say you wanted to chance it, and you're like, oh, I know he's entering this fight with pre-existing condition, some kind of pre-existing condition. And then you get dropped in the first round, your face is cut and bloody, and let's say he's struggling with whatever pre-existing condition that they say he has. Why wouldn't he pull the plug like, man, this is not safe for my son. This don't look like my son. I gotta put a stop to this. That doesn't make sense.
And I completely agree with your point. If Teofimo Lopez had something that would have potentially killed him, one also could argue the very similar thing with that of Errol Spence Jr., to the point overall to where, listen, I know that he might have a cataract issue, because if he truly did, at least heading into the Terrence Bud Crawford fight to the point to where he couldn't see punches incoming, more than likely his corner would have known about it, and they would also throw in the towel as well to prevent from Errol Spence Jr. going blind in that eye.
To me. Now, I told you guys to stay tuned to the end of this video, and that time is here. If you made it this far, shout out to you. If you're new, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. The other reason why Ego does not believe this whole jargon and storyline about, oh, he was dying in the ring and all that, because
Teofimo Lopez is not a black American fighter, and you don't need to make excuses for him, because you have no stock within that of Teofimo Lopez unless he's going up against a Caucasian fighter or a fighter that you need torn down. Now, when it came to Teofimo Lopez against Vasily Lomachenko, there was all the stock in the world because they needed that dude out of there.
Can't pull the wool over my eyes. I know too much.
And don't get me wrong, I think that Ego believes in what he's saying, and I believe overall in what he's saying as well, at least about this topic. I don't believe Teofimo Lopez either.
I'm well connected in this boxing game. And this is a picture of Teofimo immediately after the fight when they were interviewing George Kambosos. Boom. What? This is, look, you see it. This is in New York. You see the same trunks, and that's Teofimo Lopez. So the DAZN cameras are rolling, and you see he's strapped up.
Just to kind of rewind back to that fight, Teofimo was so terrible in the second half of that fight. I mean, he was so terrible. Other than the knockdown round, he just didn't have any counters for George Kambosos. He had very little defense in that fight. He was just marching forward, and George Kambosos was completely piecing him up in the second half of that fight. It was probably hands down the worst performance in Teofimo Lopez's career. And even with that, it was probably a fight that was still 7 rounds to 5. But at the end of the day, Teofimo, in my view, could have done a lot better.
George Kambosos, because he had just won the belt from Teofimo. What is Teofimo Lopez doing? Oh, yeah. He's doing a backflip. Do you understand what I'm saying? The man is doing a backflip. Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? No. You put your own in the bag. I am not a sky cap.
I keep hearing rumors that Boxing Ego was a failed actor. I'm pretty sure that I believe it.
Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth? He is doing a backflip, a whole backflip. So you mean to tell me this man has Wolverine Logan, hey bub, Berserker Barrage level of healing powers where his esophagus blew up. You somehow fought with a blown out esophagus and you fought for, let's say, 12 rounds, which this was a championship fight.
I agree with that. I'm not believing that either. I'm not believing the bullshit from Teofimo Lopez either. Something that allegedly was going to put you into the point where you almost were dead, and you're alleging that heading into that fight that was going to happen, and you got approved to head into that fight. You know, no. Sorry.
You fought for 12 whole rounds with a blown up esophagus, and then on top of that, you're hitting backflips. And you said you couldn't breathe and all that type of stuff. And you said you were dying. I mean, have you seen anybody I know most people have been in the hospital. Have you ever went into the ICU where somebody was critical or maybe even in stable condition and they just get up and hit a backflip? Come on, man. Stop playing with me. That don't even make any sense. And this is a picture from the venue. You guys see everything matches up. So until somebody can explain that, how he's doing backflips, then I don't want to hear that he was dying and all that stuff.
I agree. I'm not buying that either.
Listen, fighters' safety and their health is paramount to me. That's why it's no laughing matter. But we got to...
But it's just very interesting, once again, how Boxing Ego was willing to grill that at Teofimo Lopez. And deservingly so. Teofimo Lopez deserved this criticism. Because at the end of the day, that's another bullshit excuse. But it's just very interesting how Ego was willing to grill that at Teofimo Lopez. But Errol Spence Jr. And other fighters that he tends to like. Very interesting how they get off the hook.
Oh, BS on BS. And again, unless anybody's going to tell me how Teofimo hit a backflip if he couldn't breathe and he was dying according to 3 doctors, then shut it. Subscribe.
I agree with that. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. I just thought that I would talk about that. Teofimo is going to have an upcoming fight, I believe, against that of Jermaine Ortiz, and I will have to do a fight prediction on that. But anyways, it's going to be a very interesting fight. We'll see what happens on that. But I do agree with mainly what Boxing Ego is stating. Of course, overall, did I think he was going to hold the same standards to Teofimo Lopez as what he did to Errol Spence Jr.? Absolutely not. But it is what it is. But I do agree with what Boxing Ego is stating. I'm also not agreeing with what Teofimo Lopez is stating. You know, I think that is just another excuse. But it is what it is. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. But it's going to be very interesting to see where Teofimo Lopez goes from here. I've heard him recently call out Terrence Bud Crawford, but in my view, the fight that really needs to happen is him versus Devin Haney. I would love to see that fight. And I'm not quite sure if that fight's going to completely happen because Teofimo has not always seemed super interested in fighting that at Devin Haney. So let's see what happens. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. Talk to you all later.